The hospital was finally starting to calm down at the end of the evening, near midnight. Only the faint sounds of beeping devices and the occasional whisper from a passing nurse filled the halls as the majority of the patients were asleep. I was the new nurse on the night shift, and even though I was growing used to the eerie quiet, room 306 was the one that always made me shudder. Room 306 was said to be haunted. Stories of odd noises, shadows shifting in the corners, and even a chilly, unseen presence hovering in the air were shared by nurses who had been on the night shift longer than I had. Even though I didn't believe ghost stories, there was always a strange vibe in the room. Nevertheless, I convinced myself that it was simply jitters and that the other nurses were attempting to intimidate me since I was a newcomer. I was requested to keep an eye on a patient one evening who had been moved to room 306. Mr. Jensen, an elderly man, was the patient who was brought in due to a serious case of pneumonia. I was lucky to be assigned to the room for my first single night shift. As I got closer to the door, I couldn't help but feel like someone was watching me, but I forced myself to ignore the feeling and moved forward. As he slept, Mr. Jensen's weak chest slowly rose and fell with each breath. I noted his vital signs on the record and checked his 4. Everything appeared to be typical. However, I heard a tiny voice as I was ready to leave. I was certain I heard it, even though it was very faint, like a breeze blowing through the room. "Help me!" I looked back at Mr. Jensen, who was still sound asleep, and froze. My pulse pounding, I hurried out of the room, telling myself it must have been my imagination. I dismissed it, reasoning that it was simply the late hour and my anxiety taking over. The evenings that followed were rather calm. There were no more odd noises or murmurs, and Mr. Jensen's condition remained steady. However, I was always overcome with a sensation of dread whenever I had to enter that room. Then, on the third night, an unexplainable incident occurred. I saw the lights flickering close to room 306 at around 3 in the morning while I was going about my rounds. Except for the one light over the entrance, which was blinking wildly, the rest of the corridor was good. I hesitated, attempting to persuade myself that it was merely an electrical problem, but the flickering appeared almost purposeful, as if it were calling to me. I went over and opened the door against my better judgment. The room was frigid inside. I received the impression that I had entered a walk-in freezer. As I approached Mr. Jensen, who was motionless in his bed, my breath froze in front of me. His vitals were normal when I checked them, but the atmosphere in the room was anything but. Then I noticed it. There was a shadow in the window reflection next to Mr. Jensen's bed. It had the distinct outline of a human, although it was dim, almost like a blur. The figure was observing Mr. Jensen from the foot of his bed. I turned back, but nobody was there. In my heart, I knew I had seen something, but I tried to tell myself it was a reflection or a trick of the light. With trembling hands, I backed out of the room and shut the door, my pulse hammering in my ears. The following night, I wasn't as fortunate, but I kept what I had seen to myself for fear that people would think I was crazy. I was taking a brief break in the break room, drinking coffee, and attempting to get rid of the worry that had been bothering me the night before. It was just after midnight. Then I heard a quiet, garbled voice come through as the intercom crackled to life. "Room 306. My spine tingled at the words. None of the other nurses had called for me, and the nurses' station was empty at that hour. I waited for someone to laugh and realized it was a joke while I stood there looking into the intercom. However, the quiet continued. I reluctantly returned to room 306 after leaving the break room. The only sound in the dark, deserted hallway was my footsteps reverberating off the tile floors. I hesitated when I got to the door, my fingers lingering over the doorknob. I knew I had to see how Mr. Jensen was doing, even though I didn't want to go inside. The room remained chilly, even colder than it had been the previous evening. As the door clicked behind me, I entered and felt my stomach turn. Mr. Jensen was on his back, staring at the ceiling with his eyes wide open. His lips remained slightly open, as though he had been frozen in mid-scream, and his face was one of sheer dread. "Mr. Jensen?" I moved closer and whispered. He didn't answer. His hand was freezing when I stretched out to touch it. I checked for a pulse but couldn't find one. He had left. As I retreated from the bed, my heart sank, but then I became aware of an oddity. The shadow I had previously seen, the reflection in the window, was back, exactly where it had been the previous evening. However, it was more distinct and lucid this time. A face's silhouette and sunken eyes were visible, staring directly at me. Reaching for the door, I staggered back, almost stumbling over my own feet. I ripped it open and ran away, not pausing until I was back in the well-lit corridor. With my thoughts racing, I drew a trembling breath. I couldn't possibly remain in that room any longer. I discovered that room 306 had passed the next day. Strange things have been happening in that room ever since a patient passed away there years ago under odd circumstances. According to some, the patient's spirit was still present where he had suffered. Some said it was something more sinister. That night, I never returned to room 306. Fortunately, my boss agreed to my request to move to a different floor. However, the chilly, oppressive presence that lingers in that chamber, waiting for its next guest, is something I can sense every time I go by that hallway. Hospitals are supposed to be healing places, but occasionally they hang on to something else. Something that, even in death, won't go away. There had always been an uncanny silence during the night shift at St. Michael's Hospital. The faint beeps of machinery and the odd shuffling of a nurse's sneakers on the linoleum floor filled the long, sterile hallways. Sarah had only been employed at the hospital for a few weeks as a new nurse. The shadows in the dark hallways seemed to move and change when one wasn't looking, and she was still getting used to the odd rhythms of night shifts. Sarah couldn't get rid of the rumors that were circulating among the staff as she got used to her new job, rumors of a ghostly surgeon who haunted the operating room, a figure dressed in white who had done miracles, and equally unnerving, had been connected to untimely deaths. The stories had captured her attention and piqued her interest. Why did the stories make her shudder with curiosity and horror, and who was this ghostly figure? After a particularly long shift one evening, Sarah heard two seasoned nurses talking about the spectral surgeon in the break room. In a hushed, conspiratorial voice, one of them declared, "Dr. Reynolds was the best surgeon this hospital ever had. He passed away more than 2 decades ago while undergoing surgery. According to some, he never departed." A shiver went down Sarah's back. Her pulse pounding, she questioned, "What happened to him?" "Difficulties during a standard surgical procedure," the second nurse answered. "They claim that he still performs nighttime surgeries on patients. You can hear him, and if you're lucky, you might even catch a glimpse of him." Sarah's curiosity compelled her to investigate the surgery room despite her anxiety. That night, the hospital was comparatively deserted, and the sterile odor assaulted her as soon as she entered. The surgical instruments were laid neatly, awaiting their next usage in the dimly illuminated chamber. She thought she saw a shadow move across the distant wall as she got ready to inspect the equipment. She dismissed it as a trick of the light and blinked. She was about to depart when her name was called by a quiet, almost melodious voice that reverberated throughout the room. "Sarah." She looked about, trying to find the source of the voice, but she was frozen in place. With her heart thumping in her breast, she exclaimed, "Hello?" The quiet humming of the fluorescent lights overhead was all that was heard. Sarah noticed her breath when the room's temperature abruptly decreased. At the far end of the operating table, a man wearing a mask and surgical gown emerged. Despite his uncanny resemblance, Sarah was unable to identify him. The figure disappeared as she blinked once again, leaving her by herself in the chilly chamber. Sarah couldn't get rid of the feeling that something wasn't right in the operating room, even if the following few nights were a whirl of activity. In an attempt to learn more about Dr. Reynolds and his mythology, she decided to go deeper into the hospital's archives. She found a brief piece on the surgeon in the hospital library, which was filled with ancient medical journals and dusty documents. Numerous lives were saved by Dr. Thomas Reynolds, who was praised for his extraordinary abilities. However, during a procedure that would become notorious, something went awry on that fateful night. The report described the procedure used to bring a young woman in for a standard appendectomy. Although the surgery was intended to be simple, there were issues. Despite Dr. Reynolds' heroic efforts to save her, the patient and the surgeon had ultimately perished. For years, the hospital had been plagued by rumors of misconduct, which had tarnished Dr. Reynolds' reputation. Sarah was keen to find out more information. She went in search of the night staff members who had collaborated with Dr. Reynolds. The majority were hesitant to talk, but Ms. Hayes, an elderly nurse, grudgingly consented to share her memories. Ms. Hayes continued, her voice shaking. "You know, he was brilliant. However, that night tormented him. He thought he could have kept her safe. Things began to happen in the operating room after he passed away. Some patients are disappearing, while others are recovering when they shouldn't be." "What do you mean by vanishing?" With her heart pounding, Sarah inquired. Ms. Hayes muttered. "Some patients would have surgery and never return, their bodies unaccounted for. They say it's Dr. Reynolds' ghost, doing nighttime surgeries, but he's also taking souls with him." Unable to resist the allure of the operating room, Sarah returned there one night to face the spectral surgeon. With the sterile walls and the bright lights creating creepy shadows, she stood in the middle of the room. "Dr. Reynolds!" she yelled, her voice resonating. "I am aware of your presence." Silence fell over her for a moment, and she felt stupid. She heard it again as she turned to go. That deep, silky, and kind voice filled the room. "Sarah!" She spun around rapidly as she sensed the room getting frigid again. With the overhead lights shining on his spectral form, Dr. Reynolds's figure emerged. "Why are you looking for me?" he said in a calming yet melancholy tone. Despite her dread, Sarah bravely said, "People are afraid of you. They claim that you haunt this medical facility. Is that accurate?" As though struggling with feelings that were beyond life and death, the figure appeared to pause. "I don't spook. I keep watch over people who are in pain. For the life I was unable to rescue, I want atonement." The sadness in his voice broke Sarah's heart. "What about the others, though? The patients who aren't there?" His voice grew louder as he replied, "They are lost like I am. I can assist them. My gift has turned into a curse, but they still turn to me for rescue." Sarah experienced a surge of empathy. Dr. Reynolds was a man ensnared by his history, not a monster. She whispered, "How may I assist you?" For a brief period, Sarah could see the agony etched on the face of the spectral surgeon. "This facility has a dark side that needs to be addressed. Maybe I can find peace if you can assist me in revealing the truth." Sarah was determined to assist, so she started looking into the hospital's procedures and discovered several malpractice instances that had been forgotten over time. Under the direction of Dr. Reynolds, she exposed the corrupt practices and carelessness that had resulted in the loss of so many lives at St. Michael's Hospital. When the reality was revealed, Sarah saw patients who had been thought to be hopeless recover miraculously, while others started to disappear for unknown reasons. Dr. Reynolds' spirit became more tangible, opening up to other employees and challenging them to face their prior issues. "This man deserves the truth," Sarah yelled, her voice echoing through the operating room as the lights flickered and the temperature dropped as the surgery began. In a dramatic confrontation, Sarah found herself back in the operating room with the same staff who had rejected her claims, and they were there to see the miraculous recovery of a terminally ill patient, whom Dr. Reynolds had been guiding through the procedure. Sarah disclosed the unreported malpractice instances and the unaccounted for patients, leaving the staff stunned. The tension in the room increased as they realized what they had done. Dr. Reynolds appeared as a spectral presence, keeping guard over the patient on the table as she spoke. He muttered, "We can save him together." And Sarah felt a rush of energy as she covered the patient's palm. Hope and healing were brought into the room by Dr. Reynolds' energy and determination. The atmosphere changed when the surgery ended smoothly and the personnel cheered. A feeling of calm descended upon the operating room as the spectral presence that had plagued it for so long started to diminish. Dr. Reynolds' lifeless eyes glowed with gratitude as he gazed at Sarah. With an increasingly ethereal shape, he muttered, "Thank you. You've released me." Sarah had a feeling of relief as he disappeared into the light. She was aware that the truth had finally won out, and the gloom that had surrounded St. Michael's Hospital was beginning to fade. Honoring the memory of those who had died and the spirit of the spectral surgeon who had led her on this journey, she would carry on with her task. After that evening, St. Michael's Hospital changed into a haven of recovery and hope, where tales of salvation surpassed those of tragedy. Sarah saw the warmth of Dr. Reynolds' spirit guiding her in her quest to save lives, both lost and alive, as she moved through the hallways.